There, welcome to Bible/Chat. Kevin, hello.
Hi, how are you, John?
I'm great. We had a good intro there. I said, "Are you ready?" Kevin said, and then I started the video. Anyway, I hope you're doing well.
Good. I hope you're doing well.
Yes, very good.
I'm doing well.
I'm stiff a little bit. Can I stretch?
Ooh, have you ever thought about yoga?
No, but this brings us to our question.
This is the question. So
yeah.
The question is related to yoga. On the face of it, street level, you would want to say, is it okay for a Christian to do yoga? Obviously, there are ties in Hinduism to what we would say are demonic ideologies and things like that. So, okay, that might cause a Christian to hesitate with that.
Yeah.
But actually doing the textual work, if you're trying to anchor your views, not in your feelings, but in the text, you look at a passage like 1 Corinthians 8, and the question actually sets this up. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul's talking about food sacrificed to idols, the conscience issue. And he says, concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know, verse 4, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no God but one.
Yeah.
And so he's like, they call these things gods, they call these things, other beings and things like that, but that's not actually real. Like there is no sun god or whatever. That he's not out there, alongside God.
Yeah.
So it seems like Paul's kind of dismissing that and saying this stuff isn't real, all the hubbub around it. But in 10:20, he says, the things to which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God, and I don't want you to become sharers in demons.
Yeah.
And so it could seem like he's saying two different things, contradictory things, in the span of 2 or 3 chapters. So when it comes to the text, how do you reconcile chapter 8 with chapter 10, and then how would that apply to yoga?
Yeah, this is very good. It's a tricky question. So just to start with, yoga is just stretching, right? But it's stretching that's associated with essentially like access to the divine in Hinduism. There are large yoga facilities in India, the Brahma Kumari, for example, large yoga group. They believe that they're accessing God through stretching, various forms of yoga. So there is demonic activity that's happening there. Just to be very clear, that is false worship of a false demon god that doesn't really exist, but is a false god, a false religious system. So how do we associate that with what's going on with yoga? Well, so there's 2 ways to think about this. One is what Paul seems to say in chapter 8, which is we know that there's no such thing as an idol in the world, that there is no God but one. So stretching is stretching, right? Those gods that they claim to worship, or that God consciousness that they claim to access through yoga, is not actually God. It's nothing. It's been made up by men, and ultimately by Satan, but it's been made up by men. It's not a real thing. And stretching doesn't have any impact on your relationship with God, the true and living God, in any way. In fact, I think God would probably want you to stretch before you go for a jog, especially when you start hitting my age. So there's a part of it where it's like the act of stretching, the functional realities of what yoga are, not a big deal. Don't worry about it.
Right.
And we should be able to say, like, hey, at the end of the day, this isn't something that you need to worry about. If you want to do it, do it. Where it gets tricky is chapter 10, because what Paul is saying in chapter 10 is actually related to demonic activity or idol worship and participating in the act of idol worship. So if someone says, hey, come over and do some yoga with me, I belong to the Brahma Kumari sect, you can't go there and say, okay, I'm going to go participate in that, and I'm just going to be there, and I'm just going to be stretching. Everyone else is going to be doing something else. They're all going to be trying to access the divine, but I'm just going to be stretching while I'm there, and it's no big deal. I would say actually don't do that. Don't go into that situation. And I wouldn't say that based on me. I would say that based on Paul.
Right.
What Paul is saying in verse 20 when he says, no, but I say the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I don't want you to become sharers in demons. And then he says, verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. In other words, you can't do both. So what he's saying is you can't functionally worship God in a context where everyone around you is doing the exact same thing that you're doing, and they're claiming to worship a demonic power. So don't put yourself into that situation. So we would say if you're invited to go and do something that is ostensibly anti-Christian and religious, don't participate in it. And that wouldn't just go to yoga, that'd go to anything like that. Like if someone says, hey, come to my church, I'm Mormon, we would say, no, don't go there.
Right.
That's not good for you.
Yeah.
You can't say, well, they say Jesus, I worship Jesus. Yeah. Don't do that. Like run from those things. Don't go and visit those, put yourself in those situations. Very unhelpful. And it's wrong. It's just downright wrong. So that's what we would say in terms of the religious component of it. Now, maybe someone says, well, I don't do yoga for any religious reason. You should come with me and join me in this stretching activity. They call it yoga. There's a guy there. He teaches us how to stretch. Is it okay to do that? And I would say, of course it's okay to do that, right? We would actually say, like, that's not wrong in any way. Right. However, there's this little contingency that Paul places, and that's in chapter 10, verse 23. He says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. So now you have another category. Right. So you have the black and white categories. Don't participate if it's demonic activity, because it's just wrong, and you can't go do that. Doesn't mean the God is real. It just means they're doing bad things, and they're worshiping a false God, so don't go into that situation. Then he says, you have this other category of edification. So he says in verse 25, in reference to meat sacrificed to idols, he says, eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. In other words, if someone says, hey, come, we're going to do this stretching thing, just go. If you want to go stretch, and you're like, yeah, I am feeling stiff. Like you're Dutch, you probably feel stiff all the time. But if you, I am feeling stiff, so he says, hey, I'm going to go stretch, then go, and it's fine. Don't ask any questions, just go and do it, it's fine. But if he says, and he even says in verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you, even if it's an unbeliever who says, hey, come to my stretching class, totally fine. But if anyone says to you, verse 28, this meat is sacrificed to idols, do not eat it.
Right.
For the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. So he says, if someone says to you, you get there and you're doing the stretching, they're like, isn't this great that we're accessing this secondary divine power? What should you do? You should stand and say, actually, I'm out. Sorry, I'm done. Or, for example, if someone says, hey, come to this stretching class. It's really cool. It's just yoga. It's not a big deal. And you get there and the guy's like, hey, we're all just going to meditate for a minute on the divine power that's surrounding us. You should back away slowly and say, hey, thank you so much. I probably won't participate. Now, if the person asks you, which they might, then what you're actually doing is receiving an opportunity to share the gospel.
Right.
It might be offensive and it might be uncomfortable to that person, but it should be offensive because what they're doing is actually evil and they're worshiping a false god. So you want to, in that case, actually pull yourself out of that situation if you've been informed of that.
Right.
And that's for not because of you. And in fact, it's very interesting. Paul says in verse 29, he says, I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's. In other words, you know that there's no such thing as this God consciousness that's being worshipped by the yoga instructor, and that's not real. But the other guy doesn't know that, and if he thinks that that's actually happening, then you should back away for his sake, because you know that's not real, it's all a lie, but he doesn't know that it's all a lie, and so you need to communicate to him, hey, what you're worshiping here is all a lie, I can't participate in it, it's actually bad, it actually is a violation against God's principles.
Yeah, it's good. It's seeing, like you mentioned, in India, people would say, like, hey, this food is sacrificed to idols or whatever, and you would say, no, thank you.
Sorry, can't take that. Yeah.
Right, and it's helpful because it does highlight that conversation.
Yeah,
which is
and in
really
many
good.
ways, like the food is just food.
Yeah,
stretching is just stretching.
Yeah,
idols are just rocks. Like it's all God's.
Yeah,
and He made it all.
Yeah,
and it all belongs to the true and living God. And I can eat food and I can stretch and I can think rocks are pretty. All that's okay. What I can't do is then take that and participate in those demonic activities, or even do those things if the other person thinks I'm participating in those activities because it's dangerous for their conscience.
It's cool to think about caring for the conscience of others, because you might be thinking I'm hungry or whatever, but actually the bigger thing to be thinking about is caring for that other person.
Totally.
And just wanting to be a steward of other people's worldviews in a sense, and try to be a force for good in that.
Yeah, just protect them.
Yeah.
And in many ways it can be very offensive, very challenging. It might be insulting to that person. But what you're actually doing, what God has actually brought to you at that moment, is an opportunity to share the gospel.
Yeah.
I mean, to see it more in the positive light. Like, hey, God is actually bringing me an opportunity to share the gospel with this person who may or may not actually know what they're doing when they get themselves into this situation. Yeah. And the true and living God wants them to know this. And so I'm going to communicate this to them here.
It's cool to think of that person, hopefully, what a better person to talk to than you know, in that time,
totally.
Rather than the Mormon or whoever,
or some other random person.
God brought you, a Bible-believing Christian, into their life to give them the gospel. It's that's great.
Exactly.
Get excited.
Yeah, totally.
So,
Well, I hope that's helpful for you on the topic of yoga and some other topics too. If you have any questions on this or any other issue, you can always email us at info@faithbibleoc.org. Thanks so much.